get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. Today on ABC News Live First, we begin with the historic verdict in the criminal hush money trial of former President Trump. He's set to speak at any minute from Trump Tower. Trump is now the first U.S. president ever to become a convicted felon after being found guilty of all 34 felony counts related to a 2016 hush money payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. The conviction comes less than 6 months before Election Day, and it's the third time this year Trump has been held accountable in court. In January, he was found liable in an $83.3 million judgment for defaming E. Jean Carroll. And in February, Trump lost a $450 million judgment for a civil fraud in his business dealings. Looking ahead, Trump still faces election interference cases from the federal government and the state of Georgia, as well as federal charges connected to alleged mishandling of classified documents. Now the Republican frontrunner is expected to speak, like I said, at any moment at Trump Tower. I want to bring in our team coverage, again, talking about the verdict and those remarks. We are awaiting them from former President Trump, and ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott is there at Trump Tower. Hey, Rachel, what's it like there right now?
Yeah, we are just minutes away from the former president walking out here at Trump Tower and delivering these remarks. We've already started to see a flurry of campaign aides start to stand along the sidelines here. It's a sign that Donald Trump is probably close to coming to deliver these remarks. Look, this is where the former president came just last night after he received that guilty verdict. We heard from him railing against this. He called it a disgrace, but the focus now turns ahead to November. So much of the former president's focus has been on the trial. We are 5 months away now from a very critical election. And the question for the former president is, how much of a political liability will this actual conviction be for the former president? We know that it has definitely hardened his support among some of his most staunch supporters. But what about some of those independents? What about some of those Republicans that had concerns about whether or not he will be convicted? The question before us now is whether the former president tries to make an appeal to those voters today as we inch closer to the election, Diane.
And I want to bring in ABC News legal contributor Brian Buckmeyer. Brian, looking back on the evidence and the testimony, what do you think were the most compelling pieces of this case that resulted in this guilty verdict?
Yeah, Diane, so I think it was a combination of things. It started at David Pecker's testimony, specifically about the creation of the catch and kill scheme and Donald Trump's involvement, but also that meeting at Trump Tower that involved Michael Cohen, David Pecker, and Donald Trump. I think the jury focused in on that in their jury questions, trying to figure out whether or not Donald Trump created or caused to be created these various documents. And I think that distinction between the two is what ultimately led to this conviction. I know that I had thought that he might only be found guilty for what he created and not caused, the jury potentially, quote unquote, splitting the baby. But of course I was wrong in that, and they found him guilty on all 34 counts. And so I think that testimony, along with just the blow-by-blow documents that the jury saw from the prosecution and how they were interwoven with this entire scheme to cover up this alleged affair, I think that's what this case was really about in terms of how it led to this conviction.
And I want to go to our executive editorial producer, John Santucci, because, John, David Pecker and Michael Cohen were the two most important witnesses in this case. Yeah. They were the two pieces of testimony that the jury wanted to hear. All the jury asked for to rehear was testimony from them. What does that do for Donald Trump, given the relationship he once had with both of these men?
Hurts him to his core. I mean, these are people that he trusted implicitly. These are people that he relied on, people that, really dealt with some of the most, if you would argue, critical things for Donald Trump, saved him from embarrassment. Now, in Michael Cohen's case, this was someone that Donald Trump, broke up with a long time ago, if you will. But again, one of his most trusted aides, his office just steps away from his in Trump Tower. David Pecker, again, think about the fact that obviously a longtime friend, still a friend, said on the stand that he still liked Donald Trump. As Olivia, who's sitting next to me, observed in real time in court, David Pecker was one of the few witnesses Donald Trump looked at during the proceedings and had a nice, cordial exchange with, because it still exists, that relationship. And I think for jurors, think about that case, right? Those two were the bookends. David Pecker was the first witness for prosecutors. Michael Cohen was the end. Ultimately, book shut. And here we are.
And Olivia, the dynamics were interesting because when all the parties came to the courtroom, they thought they were coming for essentially to be sent home to say there's still no verdict, you know, more deliberations to come. And then that sort of surprise announcement that actually the jury says they're close, they have a verdict, we need to give another, you know, half hour or so. What was it like in court as that all happened, and then, of course, as the verdict itself came down?
It's the 180 that you're talking about. Donald Trump being summoned to court by Judge Merchan to say, hey, you're going home, laughing, giddy, smiling with Todd Blanche, and then an hour later being a convicted felon because the jury came back with the verdict in that time. And it was so rare to see him so happy and, you know, smiling in the courtroom, having been there for 7 weeks. It was something we so rarely saw from him. Donald Trump didn't sit in the courtroom smiling and laughing. However, something that John just touched on about, you know, David Pecker, that cordial relationship, that was one of the best moments for Donald Trump. I'll never forget when David Pecker was giving some of that earlier testimony, talking about how good Donald Trump was for business for the National Enquirer. He told a story about saying, he remembered he put a poll out in the field as the National Enquirer saying, you know, which celebrity would you like to see run for president? And he glowed about Donald Trump, how all of the viewers loved him. He won every poll. He sold every magazine. And you could see Donald Trump kind of perk up a little bit because that was good testimony for him. So there were so few rare moments for Donald Trump where he appeared to like what he was hearing, and that was one of them. And just how quickly it turned into him becoming a convicted felon, the jury taking just about 2 minutes to rattle off 34 counts, guilty, 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 over and over again. It was rapid fire, just so quickly.
And Rachel, Olivia brings up a good point. Throughout the course of this trial, obviously there's a conviction here and a lot of negative, you know, feedback that comes with that in terms of Donald Trump and his behavior and so on. But there were also a number of witnesses called by the prosecution that had glowing things to say about this man, that he was a great boss, that he treated them respectfully, that he was, you know, loved his family and so on. So is there a way that this case helps him in terms of how voters view him as a person, given the way he was painted in that courtroom outside of these charges and this conviction?
Well, absolutely, Diane. I think it is going to help with a certain section of his base, and even just among our team. We've already reached out to so many of the Trump supporters that we have met across the country to ask them, you know, how is this verdict settling with you? Does this turn you away from the former president? Does it harden your support? And we've gotten responses back from several of those voters who say, well, in fact, it actually makes me more likely to vote for Donald Trump because I do believe that, you know, he is being persecuted against. I do believe that this was all purely political. Of course, we've also heard the other end of that. We've heard some Trump supporters that are maybe second guessing it now. They want to hear more from the former president. They want to hear what he even has to say today. They want to hear how this all plays out going forward. And just forgive me because I am looking just to my left here just to see whether or not the former president's going to round the corner at any moment. He's not exactly here yet. But that's something that the former president's going to have to contend with. And so for his team, when they came back here to Trump Tower last night, you can imagine the type of discussions that this campaign was having about the messaging that they are going to send going forward. Yes, they pulled out the traditional playbook. They started the fundraising. We're told today that the Trump campaign, per their campaign, has raised more than $30 million just right after this guilty verdict. But the question is, can they actually turn the page? Can they pivot? Talking to some allies in Trump's inner circle, they will tell you, despite this guilty verdict, despite the fact that this may be seen as a political liability for the former president, one thing that they do say is an upside for Trump is that there is time. Not a lot of time, right? The election is nearing, but still, he still has some time, a couple of months to go until the election. And so now it's a question of whether or not the former president can not have this in the minds of voters. This is not the first thing that they think of heading in. We're starting to see more people gathering. We're told that he's on his way. He's not quite here yet, but as soon as I see the former president round this corner, Diane, I will definitely let you know. But we should be just moments away from the former president walking out here at Trump Tower to deliver these remarks, again, just one day after he was convicted on all 34 counts. For the first time in American history, a former president, the presumptive Republican nominee, will be campaigning as a convicted felon, Diane.
And Rachel, is there any sense of what he's going to say today, these remarks? I mean, he has been defiant all along, but now there's a guilty verdict.
Yeah, I think we're going to hear the former president amplify much of what he said yesterday just outside of that courthouse, much of what we saw him release in his statements. And of course, on Truth Social, he's going to blast the charges that were against him. He's going to claim that this was all political. But again, how the former president appeals, how he uses this podium that's behind me to communicate directly to the American people, because again, we are in a critical election year. We are just months away from the election now. And so we know there has been pressure on the former president from close allies and advisors to try to get him to focus on what is coming up. And we've talked about this, including choosing a possible running mate. We are starting to see Secret Service sort of come over. So that means we are getting closer. We're probably about a few minutes away. And here comes the applause, which means that former President Donald Trump appears to have, he's now in the line of sight. Here he is, Diane, the former president, now walking up to the podium here at Trump Tower, again, delivering remarks. He's taking it in, he's saying thank you. The former president getting ready to speak just moments away after being convicted. Let's listen in.
Let's go ahead and listen.
This is a case where if they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone. And these are bad people. These are, in many cases, I believe, sick people. When you look at our country, what's happening, where millions and millions of people are flowing in from all parts of the world, not just South America, from Africa, from Asia, from the Middle East, and they're coming in from jails and prisons, and they're coming in from mental institutions and insane asylums. They're coming in from all over the world into our country. And we have a president and a group of fascists that don't want to do anything about it, because they could right now, today, he could stop it. But he's not. They're destroying our country. Our country is in very bad shape. And they're very much against me saying these things. They want to raise your taxes by 4 times. They want to stop you from having cars with their ridiculous mandates that make it impossible for you to get a car or afford a car. But make it very possible for China to build all of our cars. It's a very serious problem that we have. We just went through one of many experiences where we had a conflicted judge, highly conflicted. There's never been a more conflicted judge. Now, I'm under a gag order, which nobody's ever been under. No presidential candidate's ever been under a gag order before. I'm under a gag order, nasty gag order, where I've had to pay thousands of dollars in penalties and fines and was threatened with jail. Think of it, I'm the leading candidate. I'm leading Biden by a lot, and I'm leading the Republicans to the point where that's over. So I'm the leading person for president, and I'm under a gag order by a man that can't put 2 sentences together, given by a court, and they are in total conjunction with the White House and the DOJ, just so you understand. This is all done by Biden and his people. And maybe his people more importantly. I don't know if Biden knows too much about it, because I don't know if he knows about anything. But he's nevertheless the president, so we have to use his name. And this is done by Washington, and nobody's ever seen anything like it. So we have a judge who's highly conflicted. You know what the confliction is. Nobody wants to write about it, and I'm not allowed to talk about it. If I do, he said, I get put in jail. So we'll play that game a little bit longer. We won't talk about it, but you're allowed to talk about it. I hope you do, because there's never been anybody so conflicted as this. As far as the trial itself, it was very unfair. We weren't allowed to use our election expert under any circumstances. You saw what happened to some of the witnesses that were on our side. They were literally crucified by this man who looks like an angel, but he's really a devil. He looks so nice and soft. People say, oh, he seems like such a nice man. No, unless you saw him in action. And you saw that with a certain witness that went through hell. And when we wanted to do things, he wouldn't let us do those things. But when the government wanted something, they got everything. They got everything they wanted. It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. And obviously he didn't do that. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. We had a DA who was a failed DA. Crime is rampant in New York, violent crime. That's what he's really supposed to be looking at. Crime is rampant in New York. Yesterday in McDonald's, you had a man hitting him up with machetes, a machete. Whoever can imagine even a machete being wielded in a store, in a place where they're eating, and he's going rampant. And Bragg is down watching a trial on what they call crimes. They're falsifying business records. That sounds so bad. To me, it sounds very bad. You know, it's only a misdemeanor, but to me, it sounds so bad. When they say falsifying business, that's a bad thing for me. I've never had that before. I'm falsifying. You know what falsifying business records is? In the first degree. They say falsifying business records. Sounds so good, right? It means that legal expense, I paid a lawyer, totally legal. I paid a lawyer a legal expense. And a bookkeeper, without any knowledge from me, correctly marked it down in the books. A very professional woman, highly respected, she testified. Marked it down in the books as a legal expense. So a legal expense, paid a lawyer, is a legal expense in the books. It's not sheetrock, construction, or any other thing. It's a legal expense. Think of that. This is what the falsification of business records were. And I said, what else are you going to call it? What else are you going to call it? Now, I would have testified. I wanted to testify. The theory is you never testify, because as soon as you testify, anybody, if it were George Washington, don't testify, because they'll get you on something that you said slightly wrong, and then they sue you for perjury. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to. But the judge allowed them to go into everything that I was ever involved in, not this case, everything that I was ever involved in, which is a first. In other words, you could go into every single thing that I ever did. Was he a bad boy here? Was he a bad boy there? And my lawyer said, what do you need to go through? And all you wanted to do is testify simply on this case. Because I would have loved to have testified. To this day, I would have liked to have testified. But you would have said something out of whack, like it was a beautiful sunny day and it was actually raining out. And I very much appreciate the big crowd of people outside. That's incredible what's happening. The level of support has been incredible. So the whole thing is legal expense was marked down as legal expense. Think of it. This is the crime that I committed, that I'm supposed to go to jail for 187 years for. When you have violent crime all over this city at levels that nobody's ever seen before, where you have businesses leaving, and businesses are leaving because of this, because heads of businesses say, man, we don't want to get involved with that. I could go through the books of any business person in this city, and I could find things that, in theory, I guess, let's indict him, let's destroy his life. But I'm out there, and I don't mind being out there, because I'm doing something for this country, and I'm doing something for our Constitution. It's very important, far beyond me. And this can't be allowed to happen to other presidents. It should never be allowed to happen in the future. But this is far beyond me. This is bigger than Trump. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than my presidency. And the people understand it, because I just see a poll just came out, the Daily Mail. That was the first one, came out, was done last night right after the verdict, where I'm up 6 points. 6 points from what we already were. We were leading fairly substantially. We're up 6 points in the Daily Mail poll. Now, maybe other polls come out and it says something differently. But a lot of people have predicted it, because the public understands, and they understand what's going on. This is a scam. There's a rigged trial. It shouldn't have been in that venue. We shouldn't have had that judge. He should have allowed us to have an election expert. We had the best expert, most respected expert, head of the Federal Elections Commission. He was all set to testify. He was waiting for 2 days. And when it was his turn, Bragg's people protested, and the judge knocked him out, said you can't testify. He actually said you can't testify for anything having to do with the trial. You can say what the federal elections is. Well, that doesn't help. Everybody knows that. but you can't testify. So essentially, he wasn't able to testify. Other people weren't able to testify. But with these people, they were able to use people salacious. By the way, and nothing ever happened. There was no anything. Nothing ever happened, and they know it. But they were as salacious as they could be, and it had nothing to do with the case, but it had to do with politics. And do you notice the timing? The timing was perfect. This case was dead. It was dropped by every agency, every governmental board. It was dropped by the highly respected Southern District. They said, no, there's no case here. It was dropped by federal election, and that's what it's about. This is about a federal election, not a state election. You're not even allowed to look at it. They took the state and the city, and they went into a federal election. They're not allowed. The people from federal election, Southern District, and Washington dropped the case. Everybody dropped the case. There was no case. Cy Vance dropped the case. And when Bragg came in, he said, this is the most ridiculous case I've ever seen. And who would have a certain person, again, gag order, who would have a certain person like this ever testify? He said, this is essentially one of the worst people I've ever seen, ever, to testify. He said, the craziest case I've ever seen, this is Bragg. Then when I announced I was running for president, long time later, they decided to revive this case. And they got a judge, Judge Marchand, who was responsible for another case that was also brought. It destroyed the life of a very good man, by the way. Destroyed the life of a very good man who went to prison once, and then they just put him in prison again because they said he lied. He didn't lie. I looked at the statements he made. In fact, he didn't remember something, and they put him in jail. Again, they've destroyed him. With me for many years, he was an honorable person. He was an honest man. And if you look at what he did, supposedly, it never happened. There's never been anything like this. Over the education of his grandchildren. Over, he didn't report that he had a car or 2 cars on his income. I don't know. I wonder how many people here have cars. I wonder how many people said, oh, gee, I have a car that's worth X dollars. How do you even figure it? And I guess you do have to report it, but I would say probably almost nobody does. Nobody even thinks about it. They put this man, they destroyed this man, but they put him in jail again because they didn't want him to testify. They didn't want him to testify. That's why he went to jail. They put him in jail twice. He's 77 years old. Now, normally I'd say that's an old guy, but I don't feel 77. Nobody ever says that about me. I'd like them to say, gee, we have to have a little sorrow for this man, because they just don't say that about me, but maybe I'm better off that way. I think I'm probably better off that way. But they put him in jail twice. And you have to see what they put him in jail. And he was threatened by the judge. This man was told, you're going to get 15 years in jail if you don't give up Trump. And he was told that. You're going to get 15 years in jail. And he made a plea deal because he didn't want to spend the rest of his life. And he was told that viciously. We're living in a fascist state. He was told that viciously. So you can go to jail for 4 months, 5 months, or you can get 15 years in jail. So do a plea. Almost who wouldn't do that plea? Everyone does those pleas. It's a horrible thing. There's a whole group of lawyers that fight that. It's so unfair. It's so unfair. But they destroyed his life. So many other things. You look at Southern District didn't want to bring the case. Nobody wanted to bring the case. And then you know who didn't want to bring the case? Most of all is Bragg. Bragg didn't want to bring it. But then he brought it. And they tried to make it a different case. They didn't say legal expense equal legal expense. Again, if I wrote down and paid a lawyer, and by the way, this was a highly qualified lawyer. Now, I'm not allowed to use his name because of the gag order. But, you know, he's a sleazebag. Everybody knows that. Took me a while to find out. But he was effective. He did work. But he wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. You know, they like to use the word fixer. He wasn't a fixer. He was a lawyer. At the time, he was a a fully accredited lawyer. Now, he got into trouble not because of me. He got into trouble because he made outside deals, and he had something to do with taxi cabs and medallions, and he borrowed money. And that's why he went. And then he pled to three election violations. And as soon as I saw that, I said, I wonder why he did that. He pled. He took a deal. Now, he took a deal because he wanted to get off. In other words, I'll take a plea deal and I want to get off. And he wanted to make a deal with the Southern District. And they wrote the worst report I think I've ever seen on any human being, other than the report that was written on James Comey by the Inspector General, a very great Inspector General, actually, wrote a report that was so bad. This one was possibly worse. The Southern District, the judge didn't let us use it. He said, it's hearsay. I said, it's not hearsay. Wouldn't let us use it. This is about the man. But he got in trouble for a very simple reason, because he was involved with borrowing a lot of money, and he did something with the banks. I don't know if it's defrauded the banks, but something happened. You guys know what it is. And then in addition to that, he gave up on three things where he wasn't guilty. In fact, they were going to testify in that. The head of the FEC, the Brad Smith, the election expert, #1 rated in the country, was going to testify. He took a plea on three things. He just added them in because that gave him more bargaining power with respect to me. But the three things that he pled on, having to do with the election and having to do essentially a little bit with me, they weren't crimes. They weren't crimes. Nor is paying money under an NDA. So we have an NDA, non-disclosure agreement. It's a big deal, a non-disclosure agreement. Totally honorable, totally good, totally accepted. Everybody has them. Every company has non-disclosure agreements. But the press called it slush fund and all sorts of other things. Hush money, hush money. It's not hush money. It's called a non-disclosure agreement. And most of the people in this room have a non-disclosure agreement with their company. It's a disgrace. So it's not hush money. It's a non-disclosure agreement, totally legal, totally common. Everyone has it. And what happened is he signed a non-disclosure agreement with this person, I guess other people, but it's totally honest. You're allowed to make the payment. You don't have to make it. You can make it any way you want. It's a non-disclosure agreement. And he signed that. And there was nothing wrong with signing it. And this should have been a non-case. And everybody said it was a non-case, including Bragg. Bragg said, until I ran for office. And then they saw the polls. I was leading the Republicans. I was leading the Democrats. I was leading everybody. And all of a sudden, they brought it back. It's a very sad thing that's happening in our country. And it's a thing that I'm honored. In a way, I'm honored. It's not that it's pleasant. It's very bad for family. It's very bad for friends and businesses. But I'm honored to be involved in it because somebody has to do it. And I might as well keep going and be the one. But I'm very honored to be involved because we're fighting for our Constitution. The money that was paid legally. There was nothing illegal. In fact, the lawyer in creating the NDA, because at that time he was a fully accredited lawyer. He wasn't a fixer. I never thought of him as a fixer. The media called him a fixer, or the prosecutors called him a fixer. He was a lawyer, and he was fairly good. Later on, I didn't like what he did. I didn't like, for instance, I didn't like that when I became president, he went around and made deals with companies. When I heard that, he was gone. He was gone. And he had payments coming to him. And a lot of this involved things that are very simple. There was nothing wrong. This was standard stuff, all standard stuff. Everything involved was standard. There was no crime here. In fact, I just watched a couple of the reports. You watched Jonathan Turley, Andy McCarthy, Greg Jarrett. You look at all of these people, Mark Levin, all very talented people, great people, many more. And they don't know me, essentially. They don't know me. They're legal scholars and experts. But I look at them, I watched Turley this morning saying, there's no crime here. Everybody says there's no crime here, except for this DA that's got the city out of control with crime. It's absolutely out of control. So we have an NDA that was signed. We have legal expenses. And here's the thing, on legal expenses, you have 100 where they say, they do a charge. I just recorded this out. Falsification of business records in the first degree. It sounds so bad. I said, wow. And even my own lawyers, I get very upset with them because they don't say what it is. They say, well, falsification of legal records is only a felony. Well, that's a lot. Is only they say, a misdemeanor. But they try and bring it up to a felony if there's 2 crimes. They have all these different things. The other thing is they missed the statute of limitations by a lot because this was very old. They could have brought this 7 years ago instead of bringing it right in the middle of the election. So they missed the statute of limitations. They did everything. Now, let me give you the good news. The good news is last night, we just got a report this morning, in the history of politics, I believe, maybe I'm wrong, somebody will find that I'm wrong, maybe, but I don't think so. They raised with small money donors, meaning like $21, $42, $53, $38, a record $39 million in about a 10-hour period. No, think of that. I like those people. Because so far, I guess it's backfiring. Now, I don't know. I'd rather not have it happen. I don't want to have it backfiring. I don't want to win this thing legitimately, not because they were stupid and did things that they shouldn't be doing. They shouldn't have brought this case. They were saying it this morning. This is a case that should not have been brought. I watched Andy McCarthy say this is a case that should not have been brought. And that was this morning. But they all say that. Every legal scholar has said it. And these are great people. They really understand the law. The other thing, a poll just came out. The first poll, I don't know, maybe others will be bad. But a poll just came out a little while ago. The Daily Mail. Does anybody read the Daily Mail? It's very good. They have a good poll. At least I like it today. And the Daily Mail just came out with a poll, and it has Trump up 6 points in the last 12 hours. 6 points. 6 points since this happened. Who thought this could happen? Because the people of our country know it's a hoax. They know it's a hoax. They get it. You know, they're really smart, and it's really something. So we're going to be appealing this scam. We're going to be appealing it on many different things. He wouldn't allow us to have witnesses. He wouldn't allow us to talk. He wouldn't allow us to do anything. The judge was a tyrant. And you got to see that with Bob Costello. A fine man. I've never seen anything like it. And neither has anybody that was in that courthouse where he demanded that the courthouse be cleared. Now, the good news is most of the people in the courthouse were the media. And anybody that was in the media, if you're fair, you'll say, wow. That was anger. That was crazed. He was crazed. And the reason that Bob Costello acted a little bit upset, which I think he has a right to, was that every question he was being asked was being objected to by the other side and sustained by the judge. Sustained, sustained, sustained. I think he did it many times. I don't know what the number, many times. Even I was sitting there saying, and these were basic questions. And I never saw anybody treated that way by a judge. And I've been treated very badly by 2 other judges also, because it's all the same thing. And it all comes out of the White House. Crooked Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of our country. He's the worst president in the history of our country. The most incompetent. He's the dumbest president we've ever had. He's the dumbest president, most incompetent president. And he's the most dishonest president we've ever had. And so many of he's a Manchurian candidate. You take a look at the way he treats China, Russia, so many others. You know, I ended the Russian pipeline. It was dead. he comes in and he approves it. And he gets $3.5 million, meaning $3.5 million is paid to the family, his family, from the mayor of Moscow's wife. And I said, where did that come from? Nobody wants to talk about it. But he's a very big danger to our country. And the only way they think they can win this election is by doing exactly what they're doing right now, win it in the courts because they can't win it at the ballot box. So we're going to show them that, we're going to fight. It's actually, I don't know, it's something where I'm wired in such a way that a lot of people would have gone away a long time ago. They would have gone away after impeachment hoax #1. That was a total hoax. I had great support from the Republican Party, though. Then you had impeachment hoax #2. And then they formed the committee. How about they formed the committee of thugs, the J6 committee of thugs. And they took their records and they destroyed all of the records after the committee was abandoned because those records were great for us. Now, can you imagine if Republicans did that? Everybody would have been in jail by now.
We've been listening to former President Trump delivering remarks from Trump Tower after that historic verdict, being found guilty of 34 felony counts related to a 2016 hush money payment to adult film actress Stormy Daniels. Trump is now the first U.S. president ever to become a convicted felon, that is. He's now calling that verdict very unfair. He says this should have been a non-case and is placing the blame partially on the Biden administration. I want to bring in our ABC News Chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, for a little bit more on that. Mary, this isn't the first time we've heard the former president alleging that the Biden administration was somehow involved in this, but he's talking a little more detail here than we've heard him in the past. Walk us through this, because this was a case brought by the Manhattan DA, not the federal government. So is there any base to these claims that this was somehow orchestrated by the Biden administration or the Biden campaign?
No, and look, this is a baseless narrative that Donald Trump has been pushing, that his allies have been pushing, that all of this was somehow concocted and driven by President Biden and his administration. They have argued that this is all just a political hit job, that this was a witch hunt. That is an argument that you are hearing Donald Trump make again today, and I'm sure you will hear a lot in the coming weeks and months as well. Look, what we just heard from the former president there was quite the unloading, an airing of what appeared to be a lot of pent-up grievances about the experience that he has been through for the last several weeks. He's now sort of airing that all out in the open. And while we still are waiting for an official response or any comment directly from the president himself, we are watching very closely if and when he is going to react here at the White House today. President Biden has actually been very careful over the last several weeks not to comment on this case because he doesn't want to feed this narrative from the Trump team that this is all somehow political in nature. In fact, the president has said before that, he hasn't brought this up, he hasn't discussed this, he has had no role to play in any of this. But that doesn't stop, of course, this narrative from being baked and getting out there. And it is also part of the reason why so far we have seen actually a rather sort of muted, somewhat somber response from the Biden campaign. There's no question that this is, politically could be advantageous for the Biden campaign, but they've been very careful not to celebrate this because they don't want to add fuel to this sort of narrative from the Trump team. And so you have seen the Biden campaign, instead of, going out there and celebrating this, what they have been doing is hammering home the point that, they say, while Donald Trump may now be a convicted felon, which politically you would think would be a good thing for the Biden campaign, that ultimately they say he can still win in November. He can still be president again. And so the Biden campaign is hammering home the point that ultimately it is not up to the courts, but it is up to the American voters to decide Donald Trump's future here, Diane.
And I want to go to our executive editorial producer, John Santucci, and our investigative reporter, Olivia Rubin, who was in the court throughout the case of this entire trial. Because, John, we do have a few other points to fact check, and I do want to get to that. But there is an element to what Trump is saying in terms of the rocky road that it took to get this case into trial. Cy Vance, the original New York DA, decided after investigating not to prosecute. This DA, Alvin Bragg, also decided not to prosecute and then later changed his mind. So walk us through that and what Trump is talking about when he's talking about that element of this case and how they ended up with the decision by Alvin Bragg to go forward with this case.
So where this all began, you have to remember, is twofold, right? It began actually with special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, which was one of the first times that Michael Cohen started to tell all, followed up by that congressional testimony he gave before a House committee. You know, you'll recall it, it's famous video. He called Donald Trump a liar or a cheat, a bunch of other words. Remarkable moment, considering it was the first time we had seen Michael Cohen come out in that type of way, talking about the guy that he constantly protected. That investigation then was basically handed up to prosecutors in New York on multiple fronts, because recall, Michael Cohen was convicted by prosecutors in New York's Southern District. That, of course, is the federal authority here in New York. So that is why Michael Cohen went to jail, as he spoke about this morning on Good Morning America with George Stephanopoulos. Now, in the Manhattan case, it was first launched by District Attorney then Cyrus Vance. Vance actually ran out of time, recall, because Vance did not seek re-election. So it wasn't so much that Vance didn't want to actually bring the case, it's simply the clock stopped because, you know, his term was up. The new DA, Alvin Bragg, who we saw speak to cameras last night, that did ultimately bring this case, he disbanded the team that Cy Vance brought in. You'll recall one of the prosecutors involved at that time, Mark Pomerantz, came out and wrote a book blasting Bragg and others, saying there was enough here to go forward on multiple fronts with Donald Trump. Eventually, Bragg's team was reassembled. Other people came in. A prosecutor who also worked at DOJ at one point joined that team. He was in the courtroom for a good portion of proceedings, and 2 cases were brought. First, against the Trump Organization, which we know they ultimately were found guilty in that case for the way that they had those fringe benefits that benefited Donald Trump, members of the family, other executives of the company, one of which being the longtime CFO Alan Weisselberg that Donald Trump spoke about in his remarks today. Weisselberg currently in jail here in New York for lying on the stand during Donald Trump's civil case against New York Attorney General Letitia James. So the second probe that moved forward was this one. This was the grand jury that sat for several weeks in Lower Manhattan towards the end of 2022, ultimately delivering that indictment in end of March 2023, and here we are. So all of this has been going on for quite some time, and I think the really important thing to hit on, people, let's be clear, these investigations started based on statements publicly that were made in 2018. In 2018, who was the President of the United States? Donald Trump, not Joe Biden. I think that's a really important point to make to viewers at home.
And Olivia, one of the other things we just heard Trump say is that he could spend 87 years in jail over this case. I saw you nodding your head the moment he said that. You've been in court throughout this trial, so let's talk a little bit about that element of it. But let's start first with the sentence. Scheduled for July 11th, what is he facing during sentencing?
Of course. So, of course, he's facing just over a year to 4 years maximum. No one thinks that he is going to be going to jail for this. We had a legal expert on talking about how this was, you know, a Class E felony. No one goes to jail for Class E felonies in his experiences. Plus, you add on the fact that Donald Trump is an older man. He has no priors. He, you know, has a lot going for him. So it's very unlikely that he's going to jail. And even if, you know, I just did the math quite quickly on my calendar, even if he took the maximum 4 years for all 34 counts, it still wouldn't add up to 187 years in prison. So that, of course, is a number pulled out of thin air. And it is not likely that Donald Trump will go to prison. He did, however, when he mentioned he was threatened with jail, that is accurate. The judge did say that if he violated the gag order one more time, he would send him to jail. He looked right at Donald Trump and said, I don't want to have to do that because you could be the next leader of the free world. But if you don't obey the gag order, you will be going to prison. And it was quite a stunning moment to threaten the former president with jail time, but also moving into some of the more substantive, you know, items he talked about. You know, he talked about not being allowed to put an election expert on. That is not totally accurate. He was allowed to put his election expert forward, but Merchan significantly limited what that expert would have been able to say. Essentially, what Merchan ruled was that he can't have a witness for the defense interpreting the law for the jury. He said, I am the only one in this courtroom that can interpret the law, so you cannot put someone on to try to do my job. And then one other thing about his own testimony. He said he wanted to testify, but he couldn't testify. He could testify. He said, no one testifies. It ultimately would have hurt him. That is the decision he made. That's not to say he couldn't testify. And specifically when he says, they could have asked me about everything that I ever did, what he's referring to there is prosecutors' effort to ask him about prior legal issues. And the judge did ultimately decide on that if Donald Trump took the stand, he would have been allowed to be asked on cross-examination about some of those prior convictions or gag orders. But however, the judge did limit the scope. Prosecutors, to pull a random number out of my head, if prosecutors asked to ask him about 10 things, Judge Merchan said that they could ask him about 6 things. So it was a bit of a give and a take, but certainly factoring in, you don't want to talk about your previous convictions or bad acts in front of a jury. So, just important to get on the record about those things that he's ticking through and get the full context and picture around them.
Yeah, and our Rachel Scott was there in the room as former President Trump was speaking. Rachel, how was the address received there at Trump Tower?
Well, of course, you have some of his supporters lined up right to the side of the former president. He was sort of feeding off of that applause when he was delivering certain lines. But look, if this was a speech that was sort of meant to turn the page, to look ahead to the election that is less than 5 months away now, this was not that speech. You heard the former president. He went through a long list of grievances. At times, he sounded very angry and frustrated. Obviously, he's unhappy about how this all played out. He, of course, is not happy with this guilty verdict. He went on to call it all political. He went on then to not only rail against President Biden, but also he didn't really necessarily lay out any clear policies. We heard him toward the end talk about maybe immigration. He talked about crime, but didn't actually say anything that he would want to do to sort of address those issues. So for the former president, this was a space for him to come forward after all of this news coverage of his guilty verdicts, guilty on all 34 counts, come before the cameras and try to give his spin on it, try to give his narrative of it. But again, Diane, we were talking right before the former president walked out, and we were wondering whether or not the former president was going to try and shift the narrative here. We didn't really see that. We saw him revisiting a lot of the claims that he's been making over the last several weeks, a lot of the claims that he's been making on social media and on Truth Social, Diane.
And I want to bring in our legal contributor, Chris Timmons, for a little bit more on what the former president was saying about the case. Chris, I want to go to Olivia's point about him potentially testifying, right? Trump's saying that he couldn't testify because the judge had ruled they could ask him about anything. And to Olivia's point, he did rule that he could be asked about prior cases. Is that unusual for Trump to allow, for a judge to allow that broad of a scope when putting a defendant like this potentially on the stand?
Not at all, Diane. I mean, prior bad acts is codified in the evidence code across the United States. And so if somebody's done something wrong in the past, they can be asked about it, whether it's a criminal conviction or not. So that ruling was pretty standard. One of the things you've got to keep in mind on an appellate level is judges get a lot of deference when it comes to an evidentiary ruling. And that's what those calls were that Olivia was talking about. Those were evidentiary rulings. What evidence is coming in, what evidence is not. And so the Court of Appeals sort of looks at it. If you think about it as baseball, it's calling balls and strikes, and you're doing it in real time. And so that's not the luxury that they don't have the luxury of a lot of time. Of course, this particular case, he had some time to think about it, but the Court of Appeals gives you the benefit and the deference that, you're the one that's watching the trial. You're the one that's seeing these witnesses live. And so it's very difficult to have a case overturned on evidentiary grounds like those 6 or the things that Olivia was talking about, Diane.
And Chris, we also heard Trump mention Bob Costello, who was a defense witness in the case. We heard him talk about Michael Cohen, though I'm not sure he actually said his name, but it was clear that that's what he was talking about when he said, he wasn't a fixer, he was an attorney, and so on. Is he still under gag order, or is that gag order no longer since the verdict has come down? How does that work?
Yeah, so Diane, the case isn't concluded until sentencing, and so he still is under the gag order until sentencing. He might even, and I'm not sure the answer to the question, whether he's under the gag order after sentencing and when the case is up on appeal, if the gag order still applies. Typically, at that point, the baton is passed from the trial court up to the appellate court, but the trial court still has jurisdiction at this point. Now, it's less damaging because the jury's already reached a verdict. So, what the former president says about Michael Cohen, what he says about Stormy Daniels isn't going to have the possibility of affecting the verdict. But the trial judge still has the case. And if he wanted to, he could find that the former president violated the gag order. Again, it's not as damaging now that we have a verdict as it would be before they testified or before the jury reached a verdict in the case. But nevertheless, until that sentence comes down, this is a pending case. It's not a final judgment.
And Rachel, we're now seeing on X, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan has announced that he's demanding prosecutors appear for a congressional hearing.
Sorry, Diane. Yeah, I was just looking at that on my phone just now. That just came out just moments ago from Jim Jordan. And again, this is another sign of support for the former president that we are seeing from these House Republicans. I'm looking down now just to read this latest news. Yeah, Jim Jordan will demand that Alvin Bragg appear at a hearing, according to him, on June 13th to testify about what they call the unprecedented political prosecution of President Trump. This is the type of loyalty, of course, that the former president wants to see. He wants to see House Republicans and Republicans on Capitol Hill rally behind him. Now, of course, we have not necessarily heard back from Alvin Bragg of whether or not he's going to comply with this request from House Republicans, but this is sort of straight from their playbook. They will try to demand and call for many of these key players to come to Capitol Hill to testify. And again, all of that they would hope to use for political purposes as we get closer to the election as well.
And I want to go to our senior reporter, Catherine Falders, for a little bit more on that, because, Catherine, Trump's legal team is also expected to appeal here. So on what grounds are they expected to do that? What are they saying in terms of what happens next for them?
Yeah, they will appeal this, and his lead lawyer, Todd Blanche, was making the rounds on some television programs, hinting as much and stating as much, but it's not totally clear what grounds they will appeal on. They'll say potentially that the judge's instructions were unfair. They will obviously want to interview the jury if they can and maybe come up with something there. But it's not totally clear exactly what they'll do, other than that they obviously will ultimately appeal this, and it will be litigated for quite some time. Of course, we have that date, July 11th, on our calendar, and when the sentencing will be. But as Trump said in his press conference, we won't stop fighting. Of course, he's referring to the appeals. And then, of course, he has multiple other cases that likely won't go to trial before the election. So this will be the only one, obviously, that we will have seen that's gone to trial. But you can expect that this is long from the end of the road for Trump as it relates to this case. His lawyer has been calling this verdict the first step in the process. That's not totally true. Trump's been found guilty on all these counts. It should be really the end of the road for them, but they're kind of twisting it and viewing it another way, indicating that they want a long, drawn-out appeals process.
And Chris, given we're now hearing that, the House Judiciary Committee is saying they want to hear from Alvin Bragg, the DA in this case, and another prosecutor, Matt Colangelo, can this case be dissected legally in terms of whether or not it should have been brought to begin with, given a jury of 12 people just decided unanimously that Trump was guilty on all counts?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's nothing Congress can do. It's separate sovereigns. The state of New York is a different entity from the United States government. I mean, we are a federal government, meaning we're a federation, and each of the 50 different states have their own jurisdictions, their own laws, the different things that they can do. So Congress can, theoretically bring in Alvin Bragg to ask these questions, but they can't overturn the verdict. That's up for a court of appeals court in the state of New York to do if they find that there was some sort of error on behalf of Judge Merchan. But as far as Congress is concerned, they can't pass any sort of law that would acquit Donald Trump or pardon him. They just don't have that power, Diane.
And in terms of the appeal going through the legal process, do you see any points in this case, either actions by the judge or other elements of this case that could potentially leave it vulnerable, you think, to being overturned?
I mean, anytime a judge makes a decision to either let in or exclude evidence, there's going to be a ground for an appeal. That said, as I said before, trial judges get a lot of deference from the Court of Appeals in any state or even on the federal level when it comes to judges making calls on an evidentiary level. I mean, juries and charges, if there were some sort of improper charges one way or another, charges that should have been given that weren't, charges that were given that shouldn't have been, that's probably a more fruitful ground. grounds, but I'm not seeing any sort of charges or any sort of evidentiary calls that would rise to the level of something that I mean, I could be wrong. There might be something there that the Court of Appeals latches onto, but I think it's highly unlikely that the Court of Appeals overturns this decision. It's a rare thing to happen.
And Catherine, what about the other cases that Trump is still facing? Because he's awaiting sentencing here on June 11th, obviously waiting to see what happens with any sort of potential appeal. But he also still faces a federal election interference case, a Georgia election interference case, and the classified documents case in Florida. So what's the latest on those cases? And could any of them see trial before November?
I don't think so. And you mentioned Georgia, Florida, and Washington, D.C., of course, the two on the federal level that are the charges that are brought by special counsel Jack Smith, of course, are that one here in Washington, D.C., and the one in Florida. Obviously, D.C. has been stalled as we wait for the Supreme Court to rule on a presidential immunity argument brought by Trump. But down in Florida, Trump is facing 40 counts down there of mishandling classified information in maintaining some of the nation's nuclear secrets in an unsecure environment. Those are arguably some of the most serious charges overall that he's facing, and that likely won't go to trial. That judge has pushed that back and stalled that case. Of course, there's been multiple delay tactics by Donald Trump there. I think it's worth emphasizing that after the convention, Trump is most likely to receive intelligence briefings again. So that means that he may be able to view some of that same information that he's charged with mishandling and storing improperly, and then, of course, allegedly obstructing the government's efforts to get them back. Those are serious accusations there made by the government, and he could potentially be able to view that information again. Diane, he will be in a courthouse next month in June, at the end of June, for a series of hearings down in Florida over a period of 4 days. He doesn't have to be there. He will be there, I'm told. At least right now, he's planning to be there. So another way that he is trying to use his legal problems to capitalize politically.
And Olivia, being you were in the courtroom, I wanted to ask you about one more thing that former President Trump just said, because he talked about, the judge. We've heard him say that the judge is conflicted, and he had this quote saying he might look like an angel, but really he's the devil. But then he said something else. He said that the judge crucified our witnesses. What do you think he meant by that?
He was certainly talking about Robert Costello, who was Donald Trump's witness, his really only substantive witness that he put forward to counter the narrative made by Michael Cohen that Donald Trump had opened a back channel to him via attorney Robert Costello to try to get him to not flip after his home had been raided by the FBI. So, he's not wrong. Rob Costello sort of was severely admonished by the judge, Merchan, because he was showing some attitude on the witness stand. He was scoffing at Merchan's rulings. He was, muttering under his breath. He was at times, cutting prosecutors off with their questions. And he, at one point, struck something from the record himself. He said, strike that to the court reporter, which is the judge's job. And so it was one of the most remarkable moments of the trial. Merchan admonishing Costello, then throwing the entire press corps out of the courtroom. I wasn't in there at this time, but Aaron Katersky was tossed out of the courtroom so he could admonish Bob Costello again. So, he's not wrong. His witness was crucified, but he was, sort of showing some disrespectful courtroom decorum that clearly hit Merchan in a way that he felt he had been disrespected and needed to address it. But he was careful not to do that, Diane, in front of the jury. And Merchan was very careful not to do things in front of the jury repeatedly. I'm reminded of Stormy Daniels' testimony. Something that we didn't learn about until after, when the transcript from that day was released, was during a sidebar. Merchan called Trump's attorneys over, and the prosecutors, of course, and said, your client is cursing under his breath, and I'm calling you now and telling you in private so that the public and the jury can't hear, because I don't want to embarrass your client. So there were times where Merchan was clearly very careful about what the jury was seeing and what they were not, so as to presumably try to keep it as a fair process for both of them.
All right, we have to stop it there. Our big thanks to our powerhouse team on this historic story. Olivia, Rachel, I won't go into everybody, but thank you all, and we are going to continue and have much more on this story right after the break. Stay here.
Whenever news breaks,
we are here in